In this video, which is part 2 of a 4-part series about shooting video using the Canon M50, I'm going to summarize your ef-m lens options by use case to help you make more informed purchasing decisions. I'll be talking about vlogging, low light, B-roll, macro, and adapters to help you get better video quality out of your M50. My name is Todd Dominey, thanks for being here. If you missed part 1, in that video I unboxed a new M50 and walked you through all the settings you should change to optimize the camera for shooting video. If you just bought a Canon M50, I'd recommend checking out that video first and then coming back here to part 2. Okay, let's get started. First, vlogging. The kit version of the M50 comes with a 15 to 45mm variable zoom lens. The lens has image stabilization and a maximum aperture of f3.5 at 15mm and f6.3 at longer focal lengths. It's a good general purpose lens, but for handheld vlogging, it's not ideal. 15mm, in my opinion, isn't wide enough. The better lens for vlogging is the Canon 11 to 22mm. This lens also has image stabilization, autofocus, a similar maximum aperture of f4 at 11mm, and as you can see, is just as small and lightweight. Those few extra millimeters in focal length may not sound like much, but they actually make a big difference in your footage, because then your face isn't as tightly cropped within the frame and your audience is able to see more of the environment around you because you are shooting at a wider angle. Next, shooting video in low light. As good as the Canon 11 to 22 may be for vlogging, neither it nor the 15 to 45mm kit lens perform well in low light because they don't have particularly large maximum apertures. This is important with the Canon M50 because of its crop sensor. It needs a lot of light in order to create a decent looking image. If the camera doesn't get the light it needs, ISO values automatically go up, and then your footage looks grainy and noisy. To shoot video in low light, you need a lens with a larger maximum aperture. One of the best is the Sigma 16mm ef-m. This lens has a maximum aperture of f1.4, which means that it provides 3 additional stops of light compared to the 11 to 22. And unlike most lenses out there which get soft at their maximum aperture, the Sigma performs best wide open at f1.4 with fantastic clarity, sharpness, color, and a more dramatic looking shallow depth of field when shooting video using a wide open aperture. If 16mm was a good focal length for vlogging, I would recommend this lens instead of the Canon 11 to 22. But like the 15 to 45mm kit lens, 16mm, in my opinion, isn't wide enough. The Sigma is also a heavier lens. The only time I would use the Sigma 16mm for vlogging would be outdoors in low light during the early morning or late evening. Otherwise, I would choose the Canon 11 to 22. If you need to shoot low light video and you would prefer to use more of a standard focal length instead of wide angle, the Canon 32mm ef-m is also a great lens. The focal length of this lens is roughly equivalent to 50mm on a full frame camera. It has a maximum aperture of f1.4 and it performs just as well in low light as the Sigma 16mm. The Canon also has fantastic color and clarity. If you're not tracking a subject that's moving, you can get more cinematic looking footage by turning off autofocus on the M50 and then focusing your shot manually using the focus ring on the lens. To help you out with manual focusing, turn on the M50's focus peaking mode to make this super easy and intuitive. Now, because autofocus isn't as important when shooting B-roll, you don't necessarily need a lens that supports it. You can instead use a manual focus lens. And this opens up an entirely different world of lens options for the Canon M50. For example, this 35mm ef-m lens from Neewer. There's no autofocus, no image stabilization, but what this lens does have is a large maximum aperture of f1.7, making it another solid choice for shooting video in low light. This lens also has a long focus throw on it, which makes focusing manually more precise, and most intriguing of all, this tiny little lens has a declicked aperture ring on it, which is a feature that is normally found in far more expensive cinema lenses. If you don't know what that means, a declicked aperture just basically means that there are no hard stops when you are opening and closing the aperture, which makes changing your exposure while filming smoother and more precise, because then you can just gradually open and close your aperture instead of those abrupt changes in exposure. It's not made out of plastic, it has solid metal construction, and yet somehow, some way, this little lens sells for only, at the time of this video, $85 in the United States. If you have some vintage manual focus lens sitting around gathering dust, there's most likely an ef-m adapter for them. You can buy adapters for Pentax, Nikon F-mount, Canon FD, Yashica, M42, Leica, and I'm sure I'm probably missing a few others as well. Now, it's important to know that the Canon M50 by default out of the box will not recognize and allow you to shoot video using a manual lens like the Neewer or vintage lenses attached using adapters. However, you can easily fix that. You just need to go to the custom functions menu on the M50 and you need to enable release shutter without lens. And yes, if you happen to own Canon EF or EF-S lenses, you can easily use these lenses with adapters on the Canon M50 as well. Now, when shopping for an adapter, you basically have a choice. You can either pick up a basic EF to EF-M adapter, or you can pick up the slightly more expensive speed booster model, which is the one that you see here. Now, this adapter functions just like a regular adapter in that it allows you to attach a EF lens on the M50. However, it does something that's far more clever, because on the inside of the adapter here, there is glass. With a normal adapter, there's nothing, it's just empty on the inside. The reason it has glass, and what that glass does, is it demagnifies the image which hits the camera sensor. That demagnification process effectively makes a 50mm full frame lens like this one behave as if it is a 50mm crop sensor lens. What's also crazy about these speed boosters is the fact that that demagnification process that I just talked about effectively adds an additional stop of light to whatever lens you currently have attached. So for example, if you have an f1.4 lens attached, that means that with the speed booster, you will get an additional stop. That lens will then behave as if its maximum aperture is f1.2 instead. By the way, the speed booster is also helpful when shooting in 4K, which I'm going to talk more about in part 4 of this video series. Next, macro. Now, macro is typically used in video when capturing close-up footage of products, textures, or fine details. For a dedicated macro lens, check out the Canon EF-M 28mm macro. It's actually two lenses in one, capable of both macro and normal use. You can use this lens just like a regular 28mm autofocus lens with image stabilization, and then when you want to get super close to a subject, just turn the dial to super macro. This lens also has built-in LED lights on the front, which is kind of nuts. Now, if macro is not something you do that often, it's just something you do occasionally, you may be better off not buying a dedicated lens, but instead picking up a cheap set of extension tubes like these. If you're not familiar with extension tubes, these effectively replicate the behavior of macro lenses by decreasing the minimum focusing distance of whatever lens you have attached to it. So in the case of the M50, you would just attach an EF-M lens to the front of it here, and then mount this to the camera body, and then that lens functions as if it's a macro lens. Now, these do have a downside. Generally, image quality is not quite as good, and focusing with extension tubes can be rather temperamental as well. However, you can save a lot of money by picking up some tubes and using the lenses that you have for the purposes of macro work than buying a dedicated macro lens. If you're currently shooting video with the Canon M50, which lenses do you prefer? Which lenses do you get the best results with? Let me know in the comments below. Also below this video, in the description, you will find links to all the lenses and adapters mentioned in this video. Next time, in part 3 of this 4-part guide to shooting video using the Canon M50, I'm going to demonstrate custom picture styles, how to modify the built-in picture styles on the M50 to increase the effective dynamic range of the camera, and get footage that can be more easily color graded in post. Then finally, in part 4, I'll demonstrate the 4K mode and show you how to get better quality footage. If you enjoyed the video, please remember to give it a thumbs up. That's it for me. I'll see you next time.